Good morning, Board. Welcome to our special board meeting. We have apologies from Martin Blunden and from Mark McAteer, but we haven't received any further apologies. We have some minutes that we need to have a look at from our previous public special board meeting held on the 13th of January. Can I ask if anybody has any amendments that they wish to make, any changes that they think are required to make that an accurate record? I can't see anyone's hand up. Are we content in that case that we should approve? Fab, I can see some thumbs up. That's great. Thank you very much. In that case, we can record those as an accurate record. Ali, we've got a rolling action log. Can you give us some support with that, please?
Hi, Chair. Just in relation to this, with this being the special public meeting of the board, we're not covering the action log today.
Right.
Item 4, which is the declarations of interest, and then obviously item 5, which is the budget strategy for 2022-23.
Thank you. I seem to have a rolling action log attached to my paper, but that makes absolute sense that we would not need to cover them today. That's fine. I'm working on the basis that we have no declared interests in regard to this one agenda item, and that we are all content that we should be doing that in public. I don't hear any objections, so that allows us to move into the main body of the meeting. And I'm presuming, John, that you're going to be taking us through our financial strategy.
Yes, I am, Kirsty.
Thank you very much.
Good morning. John Thompson, Acting Director of Finance and Procurement for the service. So board members, you will recall at the last board strategy day, we went through the draft budget strategy paper, and you kindly gave me some feedback at that session. You may be relieved to note that my intention is therefore not to go through this in the same level of detail as perhaps I did at the last session. What I thought would be useful just to kind of summarise what the kind of main purpose of the overall budget strategy is, and then to highlight the kind of the changes that have happened since the actual strategy day that we undertook together. So just to summarise then, if that's okay with the board, the budget strategy has been developed to give us sufficient information, to give the board sufficient information, should I say, to understand the kind of factors that will impact the overall budget, the kind of key decisions that we're making, and the assumptions that we're using to develop the budget. It's got a number of sections, the kind of background section, which is primarily focused around the Scottish Government context, the SFRS allocation for 22-23, the strategic context for the overall budget.
Oh, John, I think you've frozen on our screens. So we'll give it a wee second or two and see if we can get that resolved, because it's certainly not an item we can do without you. Right, that's you moving again, John. So hopefully we might be able to hear you. Have a try and see.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, you're back loud and clear. Thank you very much.
I was going to blame the broadband, but I don't know if it's the broadband and the blizzards at Cambuslang, so apologies. I'll just carry on and hope that you caught the majority of that. Section 6 is really around the specifics of the capital budget itself. Moving on then, in terms of, sorry, I keep on getting a bad network quality. Moving on then, in terms of the changes to the budget strategy based on the feedback, at 5.2 and 5.3, it really was just a slight update in the fact that the staff pay award has now been agreed, and therefore I've updated that in the strategy itself. At 5.1.2, the gas and the electricity, I have to say it's a moving feast, as you will understand, and Kirsty, you pointed to the geopolitics of Russia and Ukraine. no matter what I think the position might look like in terms of gas and electricity, as soon as I put a number in the budget strategy, I know that it will change. And this afternoon, I will explain some of the impacts on that in the kind of proposed budget. But I changed it at the time to reflect the updated position on gas and electricity. At 514, Leslie, you highlighted at the strategy day that you wanted emphasis around the efficiencies and how that would link into the work that we did with Deloitte. So that section has now been referenced. And at 611, one of the things that I took to do was to share it with Scottish Government as a draft budget strategy after the meeting with yourselves, and to get feedback from Scottish Government colleagues. And they asked if we would specifically put some reference around SDMP, and that is noted at 611. The final thing that I recall from the discussion, Stuart, you recalled, if I recall you correctly, you mentioned around the capital programme in terms of the specific impact of the lack of funding and what this will mean to the service. That's not really translated into the strategy, but we will cover that as part of the capital programme this afternoon and as part of the strategy session. And then finally, at SLT on Tuesday, there was a couple of minor changes that we noticed. One of these features, if you have a document long enough, people keep on reviewing it and saying, can we tweak this? Can we tweak that? So I've got a couple of tweaks to do to the document. But if people are content, first of all, I would ask questions, or I would seek your questions, should I say, and then I would ask that the board formally approve the budget strategy for 22-23.
Okay, so as John oriented us to, we have had an opportunity to discuss this, but I'm sure board members will have further comment or question. Who would like to start? Leslie, please come in.
Thanks, Christy, and thanks, John. And I welcome this session, and it's also in line with the Deloitte's wider scope audit recommendations that we do this work. So I welcome the development and the time that we're able to spend on the budget strategy. Thank you. I've got 3 questions, if I may. In I think it was para 5.7, we're talking about the TOM, the target operating model, and we're planning to reach the target operating model by August 2024. And because we're not up at that full complement, we'll be using overtime. And I'm just wondering about the relative costs of using overtime as a filler, and whether it would be more cost effective to reach the TOM earlier and thereby have less use of overtime. But can you just talk me through your thinking on that, John, please? Thank you.
And of course, sorry, just to say, it may not just be John who can answer that. We may need to bring Ross in to support, just so you don't feel on your own, John.
No, I'm fine, and thank you, Leslie, for the question. I guess the challenge is one of almost physical constraint in terms of being able to reach the target operating model. We're obviously going through a period of recovery after COVID. There is a finite capacity in terms of our training facilities. There is also challenges in bringing through recruits to therefore reach a target operating model, and effectively it will take time to get to that position. Recognising that that's the reality, and we have put in additional recovery processes in terms of training, seeking alternative locations for training to happen, making sure that we can carry out training at local locations where possible, and even looking at alternative arrangements as to when we actually carry out the training. All those things are happening to get us to reach the target operating model as quickly as possible. But the reality is that we've got that physical constraint. So that reality being the case, We therefore understand that the only way that we can actually make sure that we have the availability that we need to run the service will require us to rely on overtime. Overtime does cost money, and therefore when we're having a discussion on the budget later on this afternoon, you will see that we have attributed additional monies into the overtime line. But Leslie, I hope that explains the position, and I'm happy for any other colleagues to offer anything else that I've maybe not covered if that's not sufficient.
Yeah, please go in, Ross.
Thanks, Chair. John's answered that extremely well. It was just really to say that I've got a presentation to give this afternoon regarding our COVID recovery work, so we'll go into some of this detail. But the journey to recover the whole-time target operating model and that timescale isn't really predicated on budget. It's on capacity to be able to bring trainees in. As John's articulated, we were impacted in terms of the numbers of trainees we could bring in during the COVID period. Largely because of some of our recruitment activities that were impacted, including medical examinations and things like that. There was also the physical distancing requirements that restricted our numbers at our training sites. We're using some fairly innovative approaches. We've got a 4-on, 4-off model at the moment for the trainees that are going through the National Training Centre at Cambuslang, which is effectively enabling us to run 2 courses concurrently, therefore doubling the intake at the moment, and that's something that we'll evaluate and look at the benefits of that. Early indication is it's really popular with both instructional staff and trainees, and that's enabling us to increase that throughput. But because of capacity issues, because of other training commitments and things like that, there is a restriction on place. So it's very much a recovery plan we've got, not really predicated on budgets, but on the capacity to undertake those activities along with other training things. And as John said, we've adjusted the overtime budget accordingly as we're undertaking that recovery work. But as I say, we can discuss that more in detail when we talk about the COVID recovery work generally this afternoon. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks very much. Next question then. On 516, we're talking about income from shared sites, and I'm just wondering whether we get all the income that we feel we should be getting from shared sites, and in particular, if the body that we're partnering with realises a capital receipt by giving up their own site, then do they get to keep all of that, or do we get a share of the divvy, as they say? Thank you.
Leslie, thank you again for that question. And short answer is no. We're not getting enough in terms of shared services and as a compensation for what we are seeking. So what we end up at the moment is a recovery of the running costs, but not that contribution to the capital side. And I think one of the elements that we've experienced is that in sharing those sites, we use the sites in different ways. So the ambulance service is much more active than perhaps what we would be at a retained site, for example, and therefore that would lead to higher wear and tear on the actual building itself. I suppose the benefit to the ambulance service is that they are able to release their estate and get that capital receipt, but we are not then in a position to get a contribution to capital for investment back into SFRS. And that's certainly something that we are highlighting to Scottish Government to say that actually we are really keen to share our premises. We are very keen to make sure that we make a success and demonstrate some of the principles around Christy around this, but we also need to make sure that we're getting the appropriate compensation, and also to see that could we work on a joint basis to perhaps invest in new builds that would help the partners as well as in SFRS. So I'm hoping that answers your question. I think you also mentioned, have we got more shared services coming down the line? And the answer to that is yes, we do. We've got a pipeline of work, and Ian could wax lyrical about that work that's going on at the moment. So once again, we've reflected what we know in the budget for next year, but we do have ongoing work to try and seek further shared services, because it's the right thing to do, despite those issues around capital contribution.
Yeah, absolutely agree, it's the right thing to do, and I hope that we get some support from partners in Scottish Government in getting an equitable financial arrangement around that. I think I'll leave it there, Kirsty. Thank you very much, John and Ross. Thank you. You're on mute.
Chair.
Sorry, Vary, you had indicated you would like to come in next. I'm doing that on the presumption that Nick and Angelina, your points are on a different point, or if they're on exact. Nick, are you on exactly the same point? Yeah. Please come in then, Nick, in advance, and then Mary.
Thank you, Chair. Big Bar Board Member John. Do we carry any financial liability in the agreements that we've made with partners when we share the accommodation, in terms of the duration of the sharing agreement? And by that, I'm thinking of reading some of the detail around sustainability of some of our buildings, and then I'm also thinking of the SDMP and perhaps potential moves away from buildings. So particularly that thought came into my mind because when you said the ambulance service there were more active in certain buildings, if we were then to think to ourselves, well, actually, we'd like to move from this building and move somewhere else, or indeed share an accommodation elsewhere, do we carry any financial liability with that in terms of a contract agreement with the Scottish Ambulance Service?
Yeah, unfortunately, Nick, I don't have the detail on that. I would probably defer to Ian because he's more involved in the shared services arrangements and may have an answer as to, do we have the right to exit at particular points? I would have thought we may have, but it's probably something that Ian could perhaps elaborate on. Thank you.
Please come in, Ian.
Thanks, Chair. Ian Morris, Acting Director of Asset Management. Yeah, Nick, we have a clause in there that within notice we can terminate any of the agreements going forward. So that was always built into the process. That we can terminate any of our parties that are there. If we decide to move away from the site, then we just give them due notice to do that. What we've also got built in is any works within the 100% areas. The way the calculation of cost is set out is divvied up within the station. If there's 100% allocation area, i.e. an office just for the ambulance service, they pick all costs associated with that, and that includes any wear and tear of the decoration within that area. Where it's 50%, then they pick up 50% of the cost of the running costs going forward. Any modifications required to bring them into the service, they've got to pick that charge up. So we're not liable for putting in partitions or doing any ICT lines or any comms lines. They bring them in themselves, and we then facilitate through our contract, through our hard FM contract, to do the works, and they're then recharged for that element. So the cost of bringing them into the building is incurred by the incoming partner, and there is a clause to terminate if we need to terminate at any point going forward with it. But what I would say is also that you've got the community transfer, asset transfer situation there. So it may be that a retain station, if it was deemed that we did not need it at some point, then I would assume that you would do a community transfer of that asset over to the third party if they wanted it at that point. Is an area that has been discussed as well going forward.
Thanks. Very comprehensive reply. Thank you, Ian.
Valerie, just come in.
It's actually quite a small point, Kirsty, and it's more directed at yourself than it is at John. The budget assumption around the NGC is sitting at 2%, and I suppose it's a very fluid situation at the moment across the piece, and I guess I'm just looking to you as our NGC connection board, Kirsty, a wee bit of assurance that you're comfortable with that.
Yes, I am comfortable with that. There has not yet been a claim from the employees' side, which we would normally expect sometime around about now, because the pay increase rate is July, and there needs to be consultation meeting around that. So there hasn't yet been a claim, but the pay award has not been in excess of 2% and has often been under 2% in the, well, certainly since the creation of the service. So yes, I am comfortable with that. Okay, if that's you content, Vary. Angelina, please.
Thank you. Angelina Foster, board member. Mine too is a very specific point. It's a drafting point. John, at 3.5 in what is otherwise a crystal clear, incredibly helpful report. But I think as currently drafted, we're sending a message we don't intend, where we are saying that what we're getting is good enough, or rather it's, you know, better than nothing, but then we're flagging it's a problem. We then say, you know, we will have difficulty remaining committed to protecting staff and the population from the risks. I'm paraphrasing slightly here, but I don't think we mean that this level of settlement puts in jeopardy our level of commitment organisationally. If you see the nuance I'm trying to pick up, I think you mean we will no longer have the financial wherewithal. I'm not suggesting that's the right drafting word, but in terms of the message, it's a very different message, and I don't think we want to send the one that's currently conveyed. Do you see what I'm trying to?
Yeah, and Angelina, I absolutely get what you're saying. So we are fully committed, is the point. But that so I shall look at that wording if I may, and just nuance that so that we get the right tone, almost in terms of what's been carried out in terms of the letter or the wording around that. So if you're happy for me to revise that on
Absolutely.
that basis, I fully understand.
Absolutely.
And thank you.
Yeah, small but helpful. Thank you. Brian. Oh, you're still muted. You're still muted, Brian. Apologies. It seems to be the morning for it. That's you now. No, you've muted again. That's you.
Okay. See, I'm not touching anything. Brian Baberstock, board member. John, thanks very much for the paper, which is very comprehensive in setting out the conditions and the assumptions which are specifically pertinent to the 2023 budget. I would suggest, however, that it's not a strategy. I don't think it's a budget strategy, and I would maybe ask, again, just to reflect on the labelling of this. A couple of points, if I may. I mean, we've referenced the target operating model, and we know from the paper and from other things the significant proportion of expenditure attributed to staffing. And Leslie had raised the question about how quickly can we get to the target operating model. I think the prior question is, are we content that the target operating model that we're working towards is the right one? And I say that because I genuinely don't know when that level was set. But what I do know, because I hear it repeatedly, is that the risks and operational environment for the service are changing almost constantly. And it was just around seeking assurance that that ambition of a TOM is indeed continues to be the right one. If I've just got a couple of other small points, so if I may, I'll just go through them if that's okay. I'm just interested to know that the £9.5 million additional funding, does that come with any strings? And I had hoped that perhaps we would have heard a little bit more about how efficiencies were going to be delivered, not in detail, because I appreciate the sensitivities round about that, but in terms of overall process. So those 3 points, if I may.
Okay, Brian, thank you for your comments. I guess the first one around, is it a strategy or is it not a strategy? I'm very much minded that the requirement here is to deliver something that gives you a good understanding as to how we are going to formulate and develop the budget, and therefore that naturally lends itself to, well, what's the environment, what's the context, what's the assumptions we're making, what's the decisions that we're making. I can hear your point around but that doesn't give us a kind of medium and long-term strategy. But the requirement is to have a strategy that reflects the budget for 22-23. So I think we're meeting the brief, but I do understand what you're saying in terms of, is it really a kind of a medium or longer term strategy? But I hope you can support what we have in front of us in terms of the documentation itself. In terms of the £9.5 million, there is obviously, it's reflected within the budget strategy that the government have set out their priorities, and government will also suggest therefore that we are there to support the delivery of some of those priorities. However, within the budget strategy itself, we've highlighted how we are going to use the money and what the £9.5 million will do for us. So we are clearly stating our intentions. And as I said, we've already shared this with government, because one of the challenges may be that there is a view that this is sufficient money to fully modernise or reform the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, where we are clear that there would have to be substantial additional funding if that was the intent of government. So I think we have explained that within the document, and given the context as to what we are going to do with the extra £9.5 million. In terms of the efficiencies, I understand your point around the process and how we're going to deliver those efficiencies. What I think you will hear today is very much what we have budgeted in terms of efficiency. So what we have identified already and removed from the budget. The process will therefore be how we're then going to monitor the delivery of those efficiencies through the monitoring reports over time. So that will be the process around it. But I take your point, Brian, that we could have mentioned a little bit more around the process for efficiencies. I think that was it.
Yeah, would you like to come back in again, Brian, and then I am going to bring in Paul?
No, that's fine. I understand some of the sensitivities, but we've still got the question on the target operating model.
I'm hoping that that's what Paul's going to come in specifically on.
So is John.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Paul Stewart, Director of Service Development. Partially on that point, but more specifically on the Service Delivery Model Programme, Chair, there's been a couple of references this morning around the Service Delivery Model Programme, around the organisational estate or the financial element of the Service Delivery Model Programme. But I've kind of mentioned before around the Service Delivery Model Programme is predicated on the management of risk, resource and demand, without necessarily the financial element taking play. Clearly, there are financial implications of any decisions that may well be made around the Service Delivery Model Programme, but the Service Delivery Model Programme is predicated on us managing our risk within the communities of Scotland and the resource and demand that is required in terms of providing our resources in that regard. Recognise that there may be financial implications in that, but the finance is not the driver for the Service Delivery Model Programme. I just wanted to put that into the forum just to make sure there was clarity on that point, Chair.
Thank you. And can I invite in Ross, who I think will be addressing with Tom?
Thanks, Chair, and apologies, I neglected to introduce myself earlier. Ross Haggart, Deputy Chief Officer. So to answer the first part of your question, Brian, which I think was the legacy of the TOM. So the current target operating model was agreed with the Fire Brigade Union in September of 2017 and is based on our 11th version of our resource-based crewing model, which is the current model that we've got in place for crewing resources across Scotland. As we spoke about earlier, when Leslie raised her questions regarding the target operating model versus overtime, when we are not operating at the target operating model, then it does cause us challenges, it causes us operational challenges, and it causes us financial challenges as well through overtime. So the current trajectory that we've got is to recover the target operating model by August 24, as is outlined within the budget strategy anyway. And I think it's the right thing to do. That's our current agreed target operating model. It's the resources that we require to currently crew our current resourcing model. Now, if anything happens over that period of time that changes our crewing model and requires us to revise our target operating model, then we will clearly do that over that time period, but that would need to follow all due processes, including appropriate consultation engagement with all relevant stakeholders. So essentially we are recovering back to our existing target operating model because that is what we require for our existing crewing arrangements. But if anything were to happen over that period, we would follow due process in order to change that. But it does cause us operational and financial difficulties if we are not up at our target operating model. So hopefully that answers your question, Brian.
Please come back in, Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. I mean, it does in a sense, and I appreciate the restrictions that exist round about this, but I am also very conscious that the risks that are facing the service, because I mean, we heard about risk, demand, and resource. Well, risk determines demand. That gives us an estimate of what resource we need. We compare that to the actual resource. And I guess my interest is how that calculation has changed over the piece, given the changing risk profile for the organisation, and just seeking some assurance that that dynamic is actually keeping pace with our consideration of the target operating model, which sounds very much it's a negotiated position agreed at a point of time, and therefore sounds static by nature. And it's just that comparison between what appears to be static and the dynamic, and it's just to understand. And maybe it's not, I'm not suggesting we go into this, it's more just to raise the issue, because it's such a driver for our expenditure, and we are talking about the budget for the year, so it felt, you know, it needs to be aired, I believe.
Yeah, and I guess, so I'm saying this out loud for clarification, please disagree with me, Ross, if I'm getting this wrong, but my understanding would be that the SDMP work is fundamental to the revision of the target operating model, because that is about what equipment we have with which numbers of people on it at what times of day, and all of those things and others, as well as risk, would be influencing how that number was made up. So I guess there's a natural flow process. Ross, can you say that in better words, please?
I wouldn't dare suggest I would say it in better words, but you're absolutely right, Chair. And I neglected to mention that over this period of time, the board is well cited on the timelines associated with SDMP. And the timeline for SDMP is clearly running in conjunction with the timeline for recovering the target operating model. So we've got a plan in place to recover the target operating model. We've got a plan in place for SDMP. Clearly, those two plans speak to one another. And if we need to make any adjustments as we're going along on this trajectory, then we will absolutely do that using appropriate due processes that I spoke about before.
Thank you. And just to underline some of the words said by Brian in relation to efficiencies, the board has a deep and long-standing interest in efficiencies, and I do appreciate that we don't have, this is a relatively high-level document, but I think that's something we would like basically continued to be tabled over the next year, so that we can look at what more we can drive out of the budget given the constraints that we are currently facing, if that makes sense. I can see some nodding. Good. Any further comments or questions from board members? Okay. On that basis, are we content to agree our budget strategy? Fab. Thank you very much. And that naturally is dependent on the very small change of wording around the focus, so that we can make it absolutely clear that we're entirely committed to delivery. It's just that financial constraints may make that challenging for us, and we don't need to see that coming back to us. We trust that you will just make that so.
Kirsty, you've hit mute, just to make you aware.
and I didn't. So that's interesting. Maybe there's a greater force telling me that it's time to end the meeting. On that exact point, we have come to the end of this meeting. So can I thank you very much for your contribution? And this is the end of this meeting. We are due to meet as a strategy group, so we will be rejoining on that. But before we do that, I'm just going to bring Ali in.
Thank you, Chair. It was just for a point of clarity for the purposes of the minute. Ali Cameron, Group Commander, Board Support Manager. Just for the purpose of this minute and to confirm for board members, the special board meeting minutes for both the public session for the West Ark Resource Centre and the private session for the Command and Control Future session that was held on the 13th of January. Just following our normal governance arrangements, these will actually be formally captured and confirmed as a true and accurate account when we meet on the 31st of March 2022. And that will also apply to today's separate special board meeting in relation to the budget strategy for 22-23. It's just to formally capture that. And just also for the purposes of the minute, we did have a late apologies from Fiona Thorburn, the Deputy Chair of the board, just to capture that also. Thank you, Chair.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Just outlining how these future minutes will be captured and some of our past ones, which of course are not being done today. Thank you very much, and I will see you again shortly. Can I suggest we reconvene at 10 o'clock? Thank you.